I'll get her maiden name.
Okay. Where did you, in what context did you meet these people?
Oh, so on Shabbat morning, we were walking to shul with David Bernstein, and they were neighbors. So he introduced me, and then Toronto, Thornhill, Rabbi Karapkin, whatever. She says, "Oh, I knew him since he was a small boy, and knows your mom, and whatever."
Oh,
That's
okay.
all I could remember.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. I have no idea who
Okay.
that is.
Okay.
All right, we'll get started in just a moment. Okay, so yesterday we were learning about landlord-tenant rights and who's responsible for what. We learned that anything that is provided by the landlord in the apartment to make it habitable is the responsibility of the landlord, such that if it breaks down, it's a landlord's responsibility to fix. But then we saw aval sha'ar tashlumin, but other financial payment outlays, kagon mayim, chashmal, water, electric, tashlume vad bayit, use the homeowners association, cleaning costs, maintenance of the public areas of the building, and the gardening of the landscaping for outside the apartment building. That's all the renter's responsibility, the tenant responsibility. Aval tashlumi vadnat bayit hanogim l'shiputz o siyud cheder hamadregot. But anything that is the need that the homeowners association is collecting in order to do building, not just maintenance, but building improvement or fixing things that break, like shehim tvarim yisodiyim or chlafet sineratu chadome, that are necessary for the operation of the apartment building, such as changing the piping for the plumbing and so forth. Mutalam al hamaskir. So those long-term fixings, that is the landlord responsibility. But let's say some breakage was caused by the usage of the tenant. Then obviously that's the responsibility of the tenant. So, for example, if the heater breaks down because the tenant's little toddler threw something into the heater to make it the machinery all get ground up in the middle, right? Which I guess in theory could happen. I'm not. Yeah. So in other words, the kid gets into the boiler room or something, and he throws one of his wooden toys into the motor, and it gets mangled. He says that's going to be the responsibility of the tenant. Shechalot al hasocher. He says, obviously that's the tenant, just no different from, let's say, the cleaning, which is also caused by the tenant. V'chein tashlumei arnona shehem l'sherut hasocher mutalim ala socher. Also, the property tax that you pay to the government has to be paid by the tenant because he's benefiting from those public works that are being provided by that arnona. V'chein mezuzah u'makeh, this is what we saw yesterday, a mezuzah and a makeh, a parapet if needed, hachova hi al hasocher kevin shoym boim lishmor alav. Those are for the needs of the tenant because they're coming to protect him. Now that's not so. I understand the mezuzah part. I'm not sure I understand the makeh part. I mean, if a guy rents an apartment, why should he expect to have to build the makeh himself? So he quotes, the Makor Baruch quotes the Shulchan Aruch, that hasocher chayev lasos makeh u'mezuzah u'letaken makam hamezuzah mishalo. That the renter, the tenant, has to make the parapet and has to put up a mezuzah. And if the place where the mezuzah is supposed to go needs to be fixed or sanded or something like that, he's got to fix that himself. And similarly, if he wants to make a ladder to climb to the roof, or an eaves trough, or to tar the roof, it doesn't necessarily mean tarring. I don't think they had tar technology when this is being written. It means lahatiach, which is to smear it with some kind of plaster or limestone. Hareza osa mishel atzmo. Then he's got to pay for it himself. And apparently, these are things that are, I don't know, I'm not sure why he would do this unless it's for the protection of water damage. And I'm not sure why that becomes the tenant's responsibility. V'hosef haramasham duhu adin kol davar she'enu masa uman mutal ala socher. And the Rama adds that anything that is not considered masa uman, that does not require the services of a technician, is considered to be the responsibility of the tenant. And the Rama concludes by saying that with all these things, you go according to the minhag of the place where you live. And I guess I would say that refinishing the roof would probably fall under the category of the minhag Medinas. Usually, that's the landlord's responsibility. So therefore, electricity, cleaning the apartment, etc., and the public spaces, that's the responsibility of the tenant because they're all done for his sake. But I don't really understand the parapet. I would think that if a guy rents an apartment that has a roof, the parapet should be supplied by the landlord. So I'm a little bit confused as to why that should be the responsibility of the tenant. Unless the landlord says, look, I'm only renting the downstairs. I don't usually go up to the roof. It's even though it's a flat roof and I have the penthouse apartment, I don't use the roof. If you want to use the roof, then it's your responsibility to build a parapet. I guess I could hear that scenario. Okay.
Rabbi, perhaps maybe they have to put the laundry on top of the roof there to let it dry.
Yeah, if the tenant wants to use instead of using the dryer, he wants to hang his clothes up to dry on the rooftop, then the landlord could say, listen, I'm renting to you my penthouse apartment. You want to go up to the roof? That's your business, but I'm not taking responsibility for building a parapet, just like I'm not taking responsibility for putting up a mezuzah. That's if you want to go up there and use it for utility, then it's your chayiv to make the parapet. Okay, okay. That to me, it's still a bit of a chiddush, Okay. The Rav Sharaga continues and he says, "Uvitikunim shetzarich lasot otam maskir." He says any kind of repair that has to be done by the landlord. Even though the tenant saw, let's say, that there was certain things that were broken in the apartment, and he said nothing. Ein omrim shezeh mechila ela hamaskir tzarich letakeno. We do not assume that his silence is an acceptance of this defect if it's something that is necessary for habitation, but rather the landlord has to repair those things. In other words, in many areas of halacha, shtika kahuda, silence is like acceptance and agreement, but not when it comes to basic living necessities like a heater or I guess maybe a ceiling fan or an air conditioner or plumbing that's not working, a broken window. Those are things that need to be in working condition in order for the tenant to be able to live there properly.
Rabbi, so
Yeah.
when you have a situation, this is always comes up with people who live in apartment buildings or condos where the heat or the air conditioning is not going on when it's actually a weather change that really they need it. Because they go by a date. My understanding is in some buildings where they decide to change. So sometimes people are freezing because they haven't turned on the heat, or likewise, it's boiling.
And that's not even controlled by the landlord, right? In those kinds of situations.
The building doesn't turn on the AC until certain date. They have like a
Right.
program.
Depends on the building. So we go by the Dina Mahot or which is or do we
Whatever the not so much Dina de Malchusa, but whatever the prevailing minhag of the place is. In other words,
suffering.
The tenant may be suffering, but that's out of the landlord's control anyway in those kinds of situations. Right. You know that when you come in is that the landlord says, listen, the home, what is it? The superintendent of the building, they have a fixed date when they turn on the AC. If it gets warm prematurely, I'll tell you what I do. I turn on all the fans and I get myself a portable AC or whatever he does, and I live with it. But that should probably be spelled out for the tenant before he takes possession of the apartment.
What they do is they open the door of the apartments because in the hallways they have AC. They open the door so they can have breeze coming in. That's what they do. They do it in other buildings.
That goes on the roof? The hallways go on the roof?
The hallways has AC all the time. And but the buildings is like that because they do it. Most of the buildings around here, it's for elderly people.
Right.
So they feel colder than the normal people, younger people. So that's why they do it.
Thank you for normal.
No, my daughter is renting an apartment and she suffered because it was very hot and they don't put AC. And it's not because older people, they're more sensitive. That's why they do it. The building grows, No, you don't save money because they tell you put an AC and plug it in and you don't pay for electricity because it's in the full bill. Also the heater, you can put heater, then they use lots of power and you don't pay extra. Because it's like you have like a flat fee.
Utilities are included.
Yeah, the electrical bill is for the whole building, so no pay more.
Rabbi, in Ontario, if the unit has air conditioning, the landlord must turn it on between June and September at a temperature no less than 26 degrees Celsius.
What is that Fahrenheit, 26?
78.
About 78.
Max, yeah, but they have to turn on the air conditioning if it has it.
Okay.
I'm impressed the rabbi said eavesdrops earlier, but I guess temperature is still okay.
That's right. Eavesdrops I've gotten used to already. Yeah.
But the June, September, it's a big window.
June, what's a 3-month window?
Yeah,
But in May, it can be really hot in May as well.
Yeah.
This May was very hot.
Yeah. So you're reading from just the Ontario ordinance, huh?
Yeah, that's the Residential Tenancy Act.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Okay. Does it say anything about heat?
Yeah, and the heat has to be turned on and cannot be turned off, even if you fail to pay your rent. Can't punish them by turning off the heat during the winter months. So September till, I don't know, whatever it is, till June, I think. You have to keep it at no less than 21 degrees Celsius.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let's just read the last paragraph. The im hamaskir lo rotze letakein lo. If the landlord does not wish to fix the heater, rashai hasocher letakein ba'atzmo ulenakot lamaskir midemei haschirut. The tenant has a right to get it fixed himself and then to deduct that from the monthly rent. In other words, he can tell the landlord, I'm not paying you for 2 months' rent because it cost me $4,000 to get the heater fixed. You refused to do it, so I took care of it myself. Now, this is not so simple, okay? Let's say I call the landlord and the landlord says, look, it's going to take me a couple of days because my regular repairman that I use for all of these things is out of town. He's on vacation. So in the meantime, use space heaters, he says, and don't worry, I'll let you deduct, let's say, the from the electric bill. I'll cover the electricity, the added electricity. This is an inconvenience for the tenant, but at the same time, it's not unreasonable for the landlord to say, I have a regular repair guy. He's going to be back next week. He's not here this week. Please wait until the repair. In other words, there is always going to be some give and take between the landlord and the tenant. There are also situations where a landlord says, okay, I'm going to take care of it. And then you don't hear from them for a week. And then you have to call them again and say, listen, I haven't heard from you. And then you have to start making threats. And this is typical of what happens in landlord-tenant relationships, especially when the landlord is, let's say, a regular balabas and owns the apartment as an investment property and is trying to cut corners as much as possible to be able to make as much profit as possible. It's human nature that a lot of times people don't behave in the way that they absolutely should, according to the letter of the law, or they want to be able to save money at the expense of the other. And the tenant, so therefore the tenant does have rights. And similarly, if the landlord has failed to fix whatever needs to be fixed in order to make the apartment habitable, the tenant can also say, I have to move into a hotel. In other words, let's say that the apartment gets infested with roaches or something, or let's say that someone broke into the apartment, and now the tenant doesn't feel safe because the front door is all busted and it can't be used. So the tenant can say, I'm going to check into a hotel for the next week, and I'm going to deduct that from the rent. He doesn't say that you can deduct the hotel costs from the rent, but he does say that you can subtract those days that you weren't able to live in the apartment. You can subtract that from the monthly rent. And we'll get from Marvin in just a second what the psak is in Ontario. If let's say a tenant has to leave the apartment because it's no longer habitable, so what Rav Sharaga is saying is that he can deduct those days that he couldn't live in the apartment from the monthly rent. Does he have a right to also deduct the cost that he had to pay for a hotel? That would seem to me double dipping, unless he could argue that it cost me X dollars over what I would normally be paying for rent to live in this hotel.
And the hotel would be more than the apartment.
Not necessarily. When you think about it, let's say a guy is paying $3,000 a month for a nice apartment, okay, or a nice home. And so what is that, $100 a day?
Yeah.
So let's say he finds an inexpensive hotel and is able to live there for a week at $100 a day. It could be a bit of a wash, but he can certainly deduct that week from the monthly rent.
It sounds like it should be one or the other, but not both.
Yeah, but not both. Okay. Now, in the footnote, the Makor Baruch says Hadavar pashut dekeven dechayiv hamaskir lahamid dira ru'il lemegurim l'chol meshech zman haschirus. It would seem obvious that since the landlord is obligated to supply a functional living space during the period of the rental, ועל זה התחייב הסוחר לשלם לו את סיכום השכירות שסיכמו עליו, and that's the reason why the tenant has to pay the monthly amount that they had agreed upon. לכן כשהמשכיר לא עומד במה שהוא מחויב, and therefore, when the landlord does not fulfill his obligations to provide that living space, ממילא הדירה שווה פחות בשכירות, then the apartment or the home is worth less. And therefore the tenant can deduct that money from that he can't, that where the house is not habitable, to make the proper repairs and then just deduct that from the rent. V'ayin od b'sefer Mishpatei HaTorah shetzarech hasocher kodem kol lohudia lamasker alzos. So it says in the Sefer Mishpatei HaTorah, and that seems to be fairly obvious, that before the tenant can take it into his own hands to repair whatever needs to be repaired, he's got to first notify the landlord. Ki ulai hamaskir yachol ba'atzmo letaken et hadira, because maybe the landlord wants to fix it himself to save money. O shemakir adam sheyachol letaken lo b'mechir muzal uchedoyme. Or maybe the landlord knows a guy who he regularly uses, who gives him a break because, let's say, the guy's the superintendent of some of his other property holdings, and therefore they have a special employment agreement whereby the guy does repairs at a significantly lower price because he gives him so much volume of business. The gam tzarich shehasocher yavi dafka uman b'mechir shemekubal l'shalem l'rov ha'unim shosim alachazu. And furthermore, even if the tenant notifies the landlord and says, look, if you can't bring a guy in the next week or so, I'm going to have to get it taken care of by myself. And then he ends up hiring a guy whose fees are exorbitant, much higher than the going rate on the street, then he cannot pass that on to the landlord. V'chein kosav b'shut hara'anach b'tshuvat Rabbi Menachem Agozi shekasav de'im nitchalkel chelek mimakom haschirus yicholim hasochrim letakna legabot mehamaskir kol ma shepazru ayin sham. And again, the same idea that if a portion of the rental space is damaged and not livable, it doesn't have to be the whole apartment. It can be even just a portion of the apartment. Let's say one bedroom has got a terrible, terrible leak, and there's water damage, and you don't want your kid inhaling the mold that is started to grow in from that space. So then the tenant can say, the rest of the apartment is fine. We've closed off that bedroom, but I'm not going to pay you for a 3-bedroom apartment when I only have 2 bedrooms. So I'm deducting that from the rent until this place is fixed. And the landlord is at the disadvantage in that situation. And so, all right. So there you have it. There you have it in broad strokes. Obviously, there's going to be some fine tuning that's necessary in each individual case. Marv, what's the any additional laws that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so in Ontario, it's the same thing in terms of notice. So if the landlord has a claim to the tenant, make a notice, give him lots of reasonable time, and tenant also. And so if the tenant is faced with uninhabitable in part or not, there's pests, there's a major problem with it, damage, whatever, and he says, look, I can't live here, then the tenant generally has the landlord has the responsibility to fix it within a reasonable time. If he doesn't, the tenant should not withhold rent, because in Ontario, you're really not allowed to. You're supposed to still pay the rent, although maybe he chooses not to, whatever, and put some pressure. But that gives rise to the risk that the landlord will give him a notice to evict him for non-payment of rent. So the bottom line is that ideally he should pay it. Maybe practically he won't pay the rent, but they both have to go to the landlord-tenant board make application, give the various notices. There's a notice for the landlord to give to evict or force payment of arrears. And then the tenant can give a notice to say the landlord's not doing his repair and maintenance job or pest control or whatever. And then it goes to the board, and the board can make an order that either one pay, also compensation for the tenant for expenses incurred for the landlord failure to do what he was supposed to do. But it all goes.
Typically, how long does that process take, Marv?
It takes a long time, and it's a broken system at this time, so it could take a year.
So it take a
Seriously.
year.
Yeah, it could take.
And what's
a
the
year.
tenant supposed to do? He's supposed to continue paying rent for the year?
No, the good news for the tenant is if he doesn't pay rent and the landlord issues what they call an N4 notice, number 4 notice to evict, it'll take a year for that too. So in the meantime, it's a stalemate. So they both stay in the apartment, they go to the landlord tenant board, and they don't get any movement for about 6 months to a year for sure. So he can stay there. The landlord can't physically kick him out. He can continue to stay and not pay the rent.
Now, and what if the tenant decides, this place is not habitable, but I'm not going to hire a mover to get rid of all my stuff. I'm just going to go into a hotel for 3 weeks, and I'm not going to pay rent for that period of time.
Right. So practically, he doesn't pay the rent. He incurs the cost of, unless he makes a deal with the landlord, but he can incur the cost of the hotel. Then go to the landlord and tenant board and say, landlord breached the lease. I want compensation for, that, and a break on the lease, on the rent and this and that, or, get a stay of the proceedings that the landlord started. It's all done at the board level, but it's not happening anytime soon. It's very difficult system to work with.
So, you let's say you're my lawyer and I'm a tenant. How would you advise me? You would disclose to me what the law states, but practically speaking, what would your advice be?
I probably say, don't pay the rent at risk of getting a notice to be evicted, but give him a written notice and a demand. Start with that first and do whatever notices you have to do, and then don't pay. Even though you're putting yourself at risk of an eviction, but it's not going to happen. It just practically. You need to get an order from the landlord and tenant board to evict, and it has to be enforced by the sheriff, which is also takes forever. So, nothing is happening quickly. So I'd say keep the pressure on the landlord who wants his rent and tell him to fix the thing before you pay the rent. Probably will happen first.
Okay. Now, so let me ask you like this. What happens if there's a dispute between the landlord and the tenant? What is considered to be habitable, right? In other words, the landlord says, what's the big deal? It's just a few flies in the house, right?
Yeah.
And the tenant says, I can't live. This place is infested with flies.
Right. Yeah.
What?
So the standard is reasonableness, but also in terms of repairs, good workmanship is the other standard. And
Good
what I would do
workmanship,
is
okay.
you'd hire an expert to come in, an inspector who's, maybe a former city guy or whatever it is, a bylaw person, come in, inspect, and then do a report, and then send the report to the landlord or his lawyer or whatever, and say, look at, here's the support for our position.
Okay, so and then you have to pay this specialist,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah, right.
for his services, and can you deduct that from the rent?
Well, then you'd claim that as compensation for having to be forced to do that because you're not doing your obligation, right?
And also to pay the lawyer's fees, right?
Exactly that too. You'd ask for that back too.
Right. Okay. The lawyer's got to be paid.
In Mexico, they have a very interesting system where there's a third-party account, and the person can deposit the rent, because you cannot just withhold the rent from. So you deposit that, it's a government account, you deposit that, you put that you're paying your rent. And when the landlord wants to get paid, he needs to show to the government that they fixed.
Oh, that's very interesting. You hear that there's they make like an escrow, like an escrow account. In Mexico, did you hear what Mordechai said? What goes on in Mexico?
Yeah. Yeah. You can try to negotiate that here too, and throw it all into a lawyer's trust account or something. Yeah.
Okay. This, I wonder if that exists in Israel, that kind of system. It's, you know, there's clearly going to be, like, from this tshuva alone, we probably don't have enough to really rule on the specific real life cases. You know, it's one thing to say, look, the heater broke, I can't live in the apartment. What if the landlord says, just get some space heaters for now, because you know, my repair guy's in Florida for the winter. What's considered to be reasonable, right? So what would you, like, a case like that comes before you, the landlord says, I'm going to put in space heaters into the apartment, and I'll pay for I'm covering the utilities anyway, so let him just put in space heaters. I'll pay for the space heaters, and I'll get the heater fixed, when my repair guy comes back from Florida. What would you say to that, Marv?
I'd say that that's probably a reasonable alternative. It's something certainly you have to take seriously.
Okay, and even though it's an inconvenience, would you knock off anything from the rent?
Yeah,
Because
yeah, maybe something for inconvenience as well. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Sounds like give and take.
yeah, there's going to have to be a give and take. There's going to have to be a give and take. Okay. Okay, the next tshuva is going to deal with al mi mutelet ptichat stima bebayit sachur. Who has to pay for a clogged drain in a rental apartment or a house rental?
The landlord, no?
No, I would say the tenant.
Yeah,
Tenant
they're
got the
probably
drain.
They were probably the one who made the clog.
Yeah,
Yeah,
tenant
the
made
drains
it
are-
up.
Yeah.
They're using it.
Over here
utilizing
from
it.
the shower or whatever.
Right. And let's say it gets so clogged that they have to replace a pipe.
But it depends if it's a building, you know, if it's yours, maybe the neighbor upstairs.
Right.
You have one pipe.
Right.
So what happens is, at least this one case came up, and we had to call in a plumber, and the plumber had to determine where the
source.
flood was. Whether it was actually in our place or whether it was in the person above us. Every time you call an insurance, for example, they always say, no, it's not our responsibility, it's the other person's responsibility. But they have to isolate it. And once they isolate it, if it's in your property, then the landlord, ultimately, your insurance has to cover it if the leak was affecting other people. But,
Okay, well, we'll talk about that tomorrow.
yeah.
All right, have a great day, everybody.